There exists a singular moment in the trajectory of your existence, a moment that arrives unannounced and uninvited, where you glance around your immediate surroundings and experience a profound realization that cuts through every illusion you've ever constructed about your journey. You examine the faces of those you've labeled as companions. You scroll through the contacts in your device searching for reassurance. You evaluate the people who share your bloodline, and in that crystallizing instant, the truth becomes undeniable. You are fundamentally and completely alone in your ambitions. Not a single person will rescue you from mediocrity. Not one individual will pour resources into the vision that keeps you awake at night. Nobody will physically push your body forward when exhaustion convinces you to surrender. And when gravity pulls you downward toward failure, there will be no safety net constructed by the hands of others to break your fall. This awakening destroys the vast majority of people who experience it, transforming them into perpetual victims who spend decades mourning the support they believed they deserved. But for a microscopic fraction of the population, this moment of absolute clarity becomes the catalyst that ignites their transformation into something the ordinary world cannot comprehend or contain. If you enjoy stories like this, consider subscribing. Most people who watch aren't subscribed yet. You've arrived at this content because something inside your consciousness has been screaming for acknowledgement, a voice that grows louder with each passing day as you navigate through a world that fundamentally misunderstands what you're trying to construct. The weight of your aspirations has become physically tangible, pressing down on your chest in the quiet hours before dawn, when the rest of humanity sleeps peacefully in their comfortable delusions. You've grown exhausted from the futile exercise of translating your vision into language that people committed to smallness can comprehend, tired of watching their eyes glaze over when you attempt to articulate the magnitude of what you're building inside your mind. The waiting has drained you, this perpetual state of anticipation for someone to grant you permission to become extraordinary, for a team to materialize from nowhere, for support structures to magically assemble themselves around your dreams. But here's the surgical truth that needs to be implanted directly into your psychological operating system. The belief that external support serves as a prerequisite for achievement represents the most catastrophic deception ever mass distributed by a society designed to keep its population weak, dependent, and controllable. Throughout history, the figures who permanently altered the trajectory of human civilization understood a principle that escapes the comprehension of ordinary people who measure their existence in comfortable increments. Machiavelli documented this truth centuries ago when he observed that power concentrates in the hands of individuals who recognize self-reliance not as an unfortunate circumstance, but as a strategic weapon. The monumental achievements that echo through generations were not produced by committees sitting around conference tables reaching consensus. They were manifested by solitary individuals who realized that their isolation wasn't a deficiency requiring correction, but rather a superpower demanding cultivation. The great conquerors who redrew maps, the philosophers who reconstructed how humans think, the entrepreneurs who built empires from literal nothing, they all shared one commonality. They stopped searching the horizon for rescuers and started recognizing themselves as the only cavalry that would ever arrive. What I'm about to reveal to you over the course of this exploration will fundamentally reprogram how you perceive your current state of abandonment, transforming what you've been conditioned to view as a weakness into the most lethal advantage you could possibly possess in the competitive landscape of achievement. We're going to systematically construct a framework for building an empire when your contact list contains nobody, when your bank account reflects zeros, when your family questions your sanity, and when your friends have long since stopped asking about your progress because they've already written you off as a lost cause. But this transformation requires a level of psychological surgery that makes most people uncomfortable. We need to extract the part of your identity that craves validation from external sources. We need to eliminate the herd animal that still lives inside your decision-making process. We need to kill the version of you that measures success by how many people are cheering from the sidelines. If the prospect of walking into complete darkness with no companions terrifies you to your core, if you need the warmth of the crowd to feel legitimate, then this message isn't meant for your consumption. You should return to the comfortable gatherings where people reassure each other that they're doing fine while their dreams die of neglect. But if you're prepared to evolve into the type of person who makes crowds nervous, who operates according to principles that ordinary people find disturbing, who builds monuments while others are still drawing blueprints and waiting for approval, then absorb every word that follows, because we're about to dismantle the foundational myths you've been programmed to accept as reality. The transformation begins with accepting that from the moment of your birth, every institution you encountered was systematically conditioning you toward dependence rather than sovereignty. But before we go deeper into how your conditioning has sabotaged your potential, you need to understand exactly why the system wants you dependent in the first place, and what happens to your competitive advantage the moment you break free from that invisible prison. Your educational system spent over a decade training you to function within group projects, teaching you that individual achievement was somehow less valuable than collaborative mediocrity, that the person who carries the entire team is somehow less admirable than the team that produces average results together. Religious institutions constructed your understanding that congregation and community represent the highest form of human organization, that isolation indicates spiritual deficiency, that you should feel guilt for wanting to separate yourself from the collective. Society bombarded you with networking propaganda, repeating the mantra that your success depends not on what you know, but on who you know, training you to scan rooms for potential connections rather than developing yourself into someone worth connecting with. This represents sophisticated psychological warfare designed to keep you controllable, because a person who needs others is a person who can be manipulated through the threat of abandonment. When you construct your life strategy around who you know rather than what you're capable of producing, you're making a catastrophic admission. You're declaring that power resides outside your control, that your destiny depends on the moods and decisions of other people who will always prioritize their interests above yours. Machiavelli wrote extensively in The Prince about the dangers of relying on forces outside your direct control, explaining that a wise individual builds their foundation on elements they personally command, rather than resources borrowed from others who can withdraw support at any moment. Every time you seek support, every time you ask for help, every time you hope someone will invest in your vision, you're not creating opportunity, you're creating debt. And debt doesn't just mean money, it means obligation, it means compromise, it means surrendering pieces of your autonomy in exchange for temporary assistance that comes with strings attached like a spider web disguised as a safety net. Think about the actual mechanics of what happens when someone helps you climb. They now own a piece of your achievement. They now have the authority to withdraw their support and watch you fall. They now possess leverage over your decisions because you owe them gratitude and reciprocity. When someone invests money in your vision, they don't become your partner, they become your master because your decisions now require their approval. When someone provides emotional support during your difficult periods, they gain the power to weaponize that support's absence, to make you feel guilty for not performing according to their expectations, to remind you that without them, you would have quit. The reason your progress has stalled isn't because you lack support. It's because you're still burning your mental energy scanning the environment for someone to validate your direction. You're diluting your vision, making it more palatable and less threatening so that people feel comfortable endorsing it. You're waiting for applause before you've even stepped on stage, seeking approval for potential rather than demonstrating results. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, because the next part reveals why most people never escape the support-seeking trap, and how your brain is biochemically designed to keep you trapped in that cycle. This is where we need to discuss what I call the 0 point, a psychological state that either destroys people or transforms them into something unstoppable. The 0 point occurs when you conduct an honest audit of your resources and you see nothing but your reflection staring back at you. No financial cushion, no influential contacts, no mentor guiding your steps, no team sharing your burden. Just you and your ambition, facing the infinite complexity of building something from nothing. Most people experience the 0 point as a panic attack, as confirmation of their inadequacy, as evidence that they should abandon their aspirations and return to the safety of conventional paths. But the outlier experiences the 0 point as liberation, as the moment when they realize that having zero support means having zero masters, that building alone means owning everything, that if nobody helped construct your empire, then nobody can claim ownership of your throne or dictate how you rule. Machiavelli's most frequently quoted observation states that it's better to be feared than loved if you cannot achieve both. And this principle applies directly to your current situation of perceived abandonment. When you're seeking support, what you're actually seeking is love. You want people to like your ideas. You want your family to express pride. You want your friends to offer encouragement. You're operating from a foundational position of emotional neediness that repels the very power you're trying to attract. Neediness emits a frequency that people with resources instinctively avoid because it signals weakness, desperation, and the likelihood that supporting you will become an endless drain rather than a mutual benefit. Have you noticed this pattern in your own experience? The more intensely you explain your vision to people, the more their interest evaporates. The more you beg for help, the faster people create distance. They're detecting your desperation and interpreting it as incompetence, as evidence that you lack the capability to execute without their intervention. Succeeding with zero support requires a fundamental shift in your internal operating system. You need to stop trying to be loved and start commanding respect through undeniable competence that speaks louder than any pitch you could deliver. This transformation means changing the fuel source that powers your daily actions. You're no longer running on the energy of encouragement and positive reinforcement. You're now running on the fuel of defiance and strategic spite. You need to look directly at the people who don't support you, the doubters who smiled politely while thinking you'd fail, the ghosts who left your messages on read, the friends who suddenly became too busy when you needed them, and you need to feel something other than sadness. You need to feel a cold, calculated determination that transforms their indifference into rocket fuel for your productivity. Their disbelief shouldn't hurt your feelings. It should sharpen your focus into a laser beam that cuts through obstacles. Consider the metaphor of a general who discovers his army has deserted him on the eve of battle, leaving him alone to face an overwhelming enemy force. Does this general sit down and weep about loyalty and betrayal? Does he waste energy mourning the support he expected but didn't receive? Absolutely not, because emotional indulgence is a luxury that people in survival mode cannot afford. Instead, he immediately assesses his remaining weapons. He evaluates the terrain for tactical advantages. He realizes that a single operator moving in shadows presents a harder target than a clumsy battalion marching in formation. He becomes asymmetrical in his approach. You are that general, and your lack of support isn't a tragedy. It's a forcing function that makes you smarter, faster, and more dangerous than you would have been with a team. A massive corporation with thousands of employees moves with the speed of bureaucracy. They need meetings to schedule meetings. They need approvals cascading through hierarchies. They need consensus before action. You can reconstruct your entire life in a single afternoon because you don't need to consult anyone. You don't need a board of directors. You just need a mirror and the willingness to make decisions. Hit that like button if this is resonating, because what I'm about to reveal next explains why isolation is actually protecting you from a threat you haven't even recognized yet. Stop viewing your isolation as punishment and start recognizing it as a sophisticated filtration system that's protecting you from contamination. It's filtering out weak people who would have slowed your progress with their doubts and limitations. It's filtering out false allies who would have appeared loyal until you achieved something worth stealing, at which point they would have stabbed you in the back and claimed they were always the brains behind your operation. You're alone because you're being protected from the gravitational pull of other people's mediocrity, from the energy drain of maintaining relationships with individuals who will never understand what you're trying to build. The emptiness you feel isn't absence, it's space. Space for you to expand into the person you need to become, without the constraints of other people's expectations weighing down your evolution. Now we need to discuss practical execution, because mindset without methodology produces nothing but philosophical conversations that lead nowhere. How do you actually wake up every single day with zero messages of encouragement, with zero accountability partners checking your progress, with zero external motivation, and still work like someone possessed by demons? You accomplish this by entering what I call the ghost phase, a concept derived from military special operations and strategic warfare. When you have no support, you have no audience. And when you have no audience, you have no need to perform for anyone's approval, which means you can disappear completely from social observation and focus entirely on building in silence. This is where most people catastrophically sabotage themselves. They have an idea and immediately broadcast it to friends, family, and social media before doing any actual work. The friend responds with doubt disguised as concern, asking if you're sure about this direction, and that tiny seed of external doubt enters your mind like a virus. You got a small dopamine hit just from talking about the goal, which tricks your brain's reward system into thinking you already made progress, so your motivation to actually execute evaporates. The ghost does not speak, and you need to take a vow of silence regarding your ambitions. Don't tell your mother what you're building. Don't tell your partner about your goals. Don't post cryptic messages on Instagram about big things coming. Silence creates pressure, and pressure creates diamonds. When you have a massive goal trapped inside you with no outlet for verbal release, it builds up in your system like steam in a sealed container. It becomes physical energy that manifests as anxiety and restlessness and an inability to sit still. This is exactly what you need, because that pressure is what will push you to work at hours when normal people are sleeping. That pressure is the only force strong enough to break through the resistance that stops most people from ever starting. When you're operating in isolation, you possess a luxury that supported people don't have: total immersion without social obligations fragmenting your attention. You don't have to attend networking happy hours where people exchange business cards and accomplish nothing. You don't have to go to birthday parties for people you barely like just to maintain appearances. You don't have to perform the exhausting theatre of being socially normal. You can let the mask fall and let the monster inside you work without interruption. Use your isolation to cultivate obsession, because the world has been conditioned to pathologize obsession as mental illness, but we recognize it as the prerequisite for excellence. If you have zero support, you absolutely must be obsessed with your craft. You must know more about your field than anyone else in your competitive landscape. You must be so technically proficient and strategically sophisticated that you become undeniable, regardless of who you know or don't know. Steve Martin articulated this principle perfectly when he said to be so good they can't ignore you. Notice he didn't say be so well connected they want to help you, or be so likable they support you. When you reach the level of undeniable, support becomes irrelevant, and ironically, that's exactly when support starts appearing. People are biologically programmed to back winners and avoid strugglers. It's a survival instinct that seeks association with success and distance from failure. As long as you're asking for help, you look like a struggler. You're signaling that you're not capable of succeeding independently. But when you emerge from silence with results, when you suddenly appear on the scene having built something impressive while nobody was watching, suddenly everyone wants to be your friend. Suddenly people claim they always knew you had it in you. Suddenly the same people who ignored you when you needed them are now reaching out to congratulate you. But here's what nobody tells you about that moment when support finally arrives, and why you need to be psychologically prepared for what I'm about to explain. You will smile at these late arrivals. You will be polite and professional in your interactions. But you will never forget the empty room. You will never forget who was there when you were carrying stones alone to build your foundation, which was nobody except the person you saw in the mirror. This memory isn't about holding grudges. It's about maintaining clarity regarding human nature, understanding that most support is opportunistic rather than genuine, that most people want to stand next to your trophy without having helped you lift it. To survive this path psychologically, you have to allow yourself to grieve, and this is the part that motivational content always skips, because it's uncomfortable and doesn't fit the highlight reel aesthetic. Building alone actually hurts. It's not just a mindset challenge, it's a visceral physical pain in your chest. It's the feeling of carrying weight that seems too heavy for one person to bear. You have to grieve the death of the future you imagined, the version where you had a cheering section supporting your journey, where your parents understood your vision, where your friends evolved alongside you rather than staying stuck in patterns you outgrew years ago. They won't grow, they won't change, they won't suddenly develop the capacity to understand what you're building, and you need to hold a funeral for the version of yourself that needed them to. This grief is real. It manifests as physical sensations in your body. It feels like betrayal and abandonment, and there will be nights when you lie awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if you're insane, wondering if maybe everyone else is right and you're wrong, wondering if you should just give up and return to normal life. This is the test that separates the outliers from everyone else. This is the valley of shadows that every exceptional person must walk through alone. This is the period where you've left the herd but haven't yet reached your destination, where you're vulnerable in the wilderness. In the wilderness, your mind plays tricks on you. You hallucinate demons that don't exist. You magnify small setbacks into catastrophes. You crave the comfort of the cage you just escaped because at least the cage was familiar and predictable. But you cannot go back, because once you've seen the truth about how most people are sleepwalking through life, once you've recognized that conventional support is just mutual sedation, keeping everyone mediocre together, you cannot unsee that reality. So you must kill the boy so the man can be born. You must kill the dependent child so the sovereign adult can rise. And this requires what psychologists call reparenting, but what we're going to call self-architecture. You must wake up every morning and look in the mirror and be the father you never had. You must look at your bank account and be the provider you never had. You must look at your emotional states and be the therapist you never had. You must literally talk to yourself out loud, commanding yourself to get up, to stop complaining, to focus, because this is the only way out. You develop a split personality, and this isn't pathology, it's strategy. There's the you that's tired, emotional, and weak, the part that wants to quit and return to comfort. And then there's the you that's the commander, the part that drags the weak version through the mud without sympathy or negotiation. Eventually, through this process of internal warfare, the weak version dies, and only the commander remains. And this is what Machiavelli meant when he wrote about the prince needing a flexible disposition. You must be capable of being cruel to yourself in the short term, so you can be kind to yourself in the long term. You deny yourself comfort now, so you can rule later. You suffer in private, so you can celebrate in public. When you have zero support, there's nobody to enable your weakness. If you sleep through your alarm, nobody wakes you up. If you don't work, you don't eat. The feedback loop is immediate and brutal. And this is actually a gift, because comfort is the enemy of greatness. Subscribe if you haven't already, because the next section reveals the dark psychological framework that transforms pain into productivity, and most people will never understand this mechanism. Support often functions as a cushion that prevents you from feeling the full impact of your own laziness and poor decisions. When you have people reassuring you that everything will be fine, you don't feel the urgency to change your behavior. When you're alone, the concrete hits hard when you fall. You learn fast because the consequences are immediate. You adapt because survival demands it. You become what Nassim Taleb calls anti-fragile, meaning you don't just resist stress, you actually grow stronger from it. Let's discuss the story you tell yourself, because narrative shapes identity, and identity shapes action. The average person tells a victim story. They say, I couldn't start my business because I didn't have funding. I couldn't get in shape because I didn't have a gym partner. I couldn't pursue my dreams because I didn't have support. And this narrative makes them powerless. You need to tell a different story, what I call the villain origin story. And I don't mean you become evil. I mean you become motivated by the slight, by the rejection, by the memory of being dismissed. Michael Jordan, arguably the greatest competitor in athletic history, was famous for manufacturing insults to motivate himself. He would convince himself that an opposing player had disrespected him just so he could summon the rage necessary to destroy them on the court. You need to adopt this psychological mechanism. Take every rejection you've experienced, every text that went unanswered, every smirk from someone who didn't take you seriously, every dismissive comment from family members who suggested you get a real job, and place all of it in a mental furnace. They didn't support you. Perfect. Use it. They laughed at your ideas. Excellent. Remember it. They excluded you from opportunities. Good. Let it fuel you. Anger is a cleaner burning fuel than sadness. Sadness makes you heavy and lethargic. It makes you want to lie down and give up. But anger makes you light and kinetic. It makes you want to move and prove and conquer. Machiavelli observed that people are simple and inclined to obey immediate needs, which makes them easy to deceive and manipulate. Don't be the person who gets deceived. Be the person who sees through the simplicity of human nature and uses it to your advantage. Understand that people didn't support you not because you lack value, but because they couldn't see what you see. They're simple. They obey immediate needs like safety and conformity and ease. While you're complex, you obey a future need like glory and power and freedom. You're speaking a language they don't understand, so stop trying to translate your vision for people who lack the capacity to comprehend it. Just build the tower so high that they have to crane their necks upward to see the top. When you succeed with zero support, the victory carries a purity that supported people will never experience. There's nobody to thank in the acceptance speech. There's nobody to share equity with. There's a deep satisfaction in knowing you walked through fire without burning, even while everyone watched and waited for you to turn to ash. To reach that point, you must master strategic isolation, because most people are isolated by accident or circumstance, but you need to be isolated by design and intention. Cut the cord on relationships that drain your energy. If you're maintaining connections with people who don't understand you, just because you're afraid of being alone, you're paying a social tax to remain in a club you don't even want membership in. Stop paying that tax. Sit in your room, stare at the wall, feel the silence, and yes, it will be loud at first because your thoughts will scream at you, telling you that you're a loser, that you have no friends, that you're making a mistake. Let those voices scream. Observe them without reacting. Analyze where they come from, and you'll realize they come from a teacher in 3rd grade who told you that you weren't special. They come from a cynical uncle who said your dreams were unrealistic. They come from television programming that taught you to crave consumer comfort over creative achievement. Those voices aren't yours. They're borrowed from sources that don't have your best interests in mind. Once the screaming stops, and it will stop if you sit with it long enough, you'll hear something else, a quiet, steady hum that's been there all along but was drowned out by the noise. That hum is your own mind coming online for the first time. That's your intuition. That's your strategic intelligence. That's the part of you that knows exactly what to do if you'll just listen to it. You cannot hear that frequency when you're surrounded by the constant noise of support groups and brainstorming sessions and networking events. Greatness is born in the void, in the silence, in the solitary hours when you're alone with your thoughts and forced to confront who you actually are beneath the social mask. Let's look at this from a purely logical perspective, devoid of emotion. Collaborations statistically fail at high rates. Partnerships dissolve and end in lawsuits. Marriages end in divorce. The statistics are overwhelmingly against any form of sustained cooperation. Whenever you introduce a second variable into your equation for success, another human being with their own agenda and limitations, you dramatically increase the complexity and the risk vectors. Humans are inherently volatile. They get sick. They get bored. They become jealous. They change their minds. They have bad days that affect their performance. They bring their personal problems into professional environments. If your plan requires another person to behave consistently and reliably, your plan is fundamentally flawed because you're building on quicksand. Machiavelli advised princes to avoid auxiliary forces, armies borrowed from other powerful leaders, because if those borrowed forces lose, you're defeated, and if they win, you become their prisoner. When you succeed using someone else's money, connections, or platform, you become their prisoner. You have to play by their rules, censor your message, compromise your vision, and accept their limitations as your own. Succeeding with zero support is the only path to owning your soul completely. And yes, it's harder. Yes, it takes longer sometimes. But is it worth the price of sovereignty? Always, without question, forever. You're building a foundation of granite that cannot be shaken, while the person who gets lifted to the mountain peak by helicopter stands at the summit with no leg muscles, and when the wind blows, they fall. The person who climbed the mountain alone, clawing their way up the rock face, bleeding and sweating and freezing, develops legs of steel, and the wind cannot move them because they've become part of the mountain itself. You want to be the climber, not the passenger. You want to earn every inch of altitude so that nobody can ever say you didn't deserve to stand at the top. This is why you must embrace difficulty as your teacher. When you hit a roadblock and there's nobody to call for help, don't panic, smile, because this is the repetition that builds the muscle. This is where you learn to solve problems independently, where you develop the pattern recognition and creative thinking that will serve you for life. When you have a mentor giving you answers, you learn nothing. You just memorize a solution that works in one specific context. But when you have to dig through uncertainty for weeks to find the answer yourself, you own that knowledge at a cellular level. It becomes part of your DNA, and you can apply it in infinite contexts. Zero support means maximum education. You're forced to learn every aspect of your field because there's nobody to delegate to. You learn marketing, product development, finance, psychology, sales, operations, everything, and you become a polymath, a weapon of mass competence. The specialist is easy to replace. The person who only knows one thing becomes obsolete when that one thing becomes automated or outsourced. But the generalist who built the entire castle from scratch, who understands every component of their empire, that person is irreplaceable. That person is dangerous. That person is sovereign. Look at your empty contact list right now and say, thank you. Thank you for forcing me to become everything I needed. Thank you for not rescuing me so I could learn to rescue myself. Thank you for the gift of isolation that transformed me into something the supported masses will never become. And now, let's build. YouTube description.